The strangest thing to them wasn't the frozen city walls that rose high above them like a barricade of bleached bone, nor the clinging, parasitic cold that had suddenly gotten deeper, boring through leather and wool to bite at the marrow of their bones. It was the gate itself. It stood wide open. The massive, iron-reinforced timbers were thrown back into the frost, completely unbarred, as if the fortress were actively welcoming them inward. This very threshold had been the boundary of everything Rian had known for a time. In his fractured memory, crossing inward meant warmth, firelight, and the safety of civilization, while the world outside represented only war, chaos, and sudden death. But crossing over it this time brought a completely different feeling. This time he wasn't a blind soldier being led by a master handler. He was walking alongside someone who knew him personally, someone who knew exactly what he was and the horrors that had been inflicted upon him. He felt safer, protected even, now that Adora was at his side. He knew, with a grim certainty, that he would have journeyed alone to this cursed place if he had been forced to, but he was profoundly glad she had chosen to walk into the jaws of the cage with him. "Are you okay?" Adora asked quietly. She had paused a half-step ahead, noticing that Rian had stopped dead beneath the shadow of the portcullis. I think so," he replied softly. He took a deep, freezing breath, watching his vapor cloud twist in the air before forcing his boots to resume their march into the city. Adora looked up at the towering architecture, her emerald eyes narrowing as she took in the grim layout. "I've been to the true Nostrudor before, back when I was much younger. You were there too, Rian. We were part of a grand elven envoy sent to the human leader to negotiate trading routes, to ask them to open the mountain passes back up." Rian searched the blank canvas of his mind. He could not recall a single detail of the event, of course, but he knew with an instinct deeper than memory to believe her every word. "It's so incredibly strange," she murmured, her voice tight with growing anxiety as she studied the surrounding buildings and structural facades. "It is so hauntingly similar to what I can remember of the capital, almost exact." "What do you mean, almost?" Rian asked, turning his head toward her. "Well, this isn't the true Nostrador, Rian. You know this, right?" Rian felt a dizzying wave of disorientation wash over him. He had almost forgotten that critical, terrifying fact. They were standing in the far, uncharted north. The real Nostrudor, the bustling kingdom of men, lay far to the west. "Oh, yeah, you're right," he replied hesitantly, a cold sweat breaking out beneath his collar. If this was not a real city of men at all, but rather a colossal fabrication, why did it look so flawlessly like one? As they walked deeper through the desolate, empty streets, Rian could swear he was looking at landmarks and sites that he should at least remember from his few days of awareness. The same cobblestone avenues, the same structural layout, the same residential blocks. But as he looked closer, he realized there were subtle, insidious things wrong with everywhere he looked. Some of the roads bent away at unnatural angles, veering off in wrong directions. Some of the stone arches that bore heroic statues looked warped, the figures' proportions slightly monstrous. Even the royal crest of the people he had known, the emblem he had seen stamped on shields and banners, was placed randomly on doorways and lintels, and its finer details were subtly altered, twisted into something unrecognizable. It had now become so bitterly cold that their breath was coming in ragged, painful gasps, and they began to seriously question whether they should risk stopping to search for extra layers of clothing. The cold felt so unnaturally deep that they both knew it wasn't the kind of frost brought on by a passing winter season. It felt alive, malignant and heavy, as if an unseen entity were actively pursuing them through the grid of the city, matching their pace just as they pursued their answers. Adora followed a half-step behind Rian, trusting his geographical memory as he navigated the turns, even though he stopped multiple times to study a passing doorway or stare down the throat of a dark, frozen alleyway. "Where do you think we should check first?" she asked him, her jaw tight as she shivered violently against the wind. "The armory," Rian replied, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "If Zarek isn't there, we can at least grab some heavy winter cloaks and find a way to get warm, hopefully." Rian turned a familiar corner, finding his way to the wide, sweeping set of stone stairs that had led down to the subterranean armory during his first days awake. He prayed silently that the architecture took them to the same destination. It did, thankfully. The stairway opened up to a wide courtyard of cracked stone, its ground gleaming a pale, sickly blue and glistening with a thick sheet of black frost. He looked toward the heavy wooden doors of the armory, but they were no longer shut. They were utterly broken. One of the massive oak panels lay shattered on the frozen ground, while the other hung precariously from a single iron hinge, bent violently in the middle section with huge, jagged chunks ripped entirely out of the wood as if by a massive claw. Just to the right of the ruined entrance, a sudden glint of silver caught both of their eyes beneath a heavy drift of snow and ice. Protruding from the white mound was what looked like the splintered shaft of a massive arrow, worn, splintered, and thoroughly blackened with age. Rian walked over to the heap slowly, his boots crunching in the snow. He knelt down, using his gauntleted hand to dust off the packed ice that lay on top. As the frozen crust fell away to the cold ground, Rian let out a sharp, horrified gasp. Staring back up at him from the ice was a fleshless, decrepit human skull. The sight triggered a violent cascade in his mind. He suddenly remembered his very last time at this exact location, the heavily armored guard who had been shot through the chest by an unseen archer, slumping lifelessly against the stone walls while his blood pooled on the floor. "Do you know this man?" Adora asked, stepping up behind him, her hand moving instinctively to her waist as she witnessed his sudden, violent physical reaction. "Not personally, no," Rian whispered, his voice trembling as he stared into the empty eye sockets of the skull. "But the last time I was here, we found this fallen soldier. Finding him is what set everything in motion. It's what drove Varric and the others to march to war." Rian reached out, his bare fingers brushing against the blackened wood of the ancient arrow shaft. Flash. Screaming. The deafening roar of running feet on stone. Varric shouting commands at the top of his lungs, his face twisted in a panic Rian had never seen. Men drawing swords, the screech of steel on steel echoing through the corridors. Then, a sudden blinding explosion of brilliant purple light that consumed the room. And then, it was gone again. The brief flash of memory had been far too short, far too fragmented for him to grasp at any tangible truth. He was left panting in the snow. Adora stared down at Rian, a profound sense of unease twisting her stomach as she watched the internal war playing out within his mind. She wished desperately that he would open up to her, that he would speak of the fragments he was seeing without her needing to constantly pry the answers from him like a forceful interrogator. Deciding to give him space to process his grief, she left Rian where he was kneeling in the snow and ventured alone into the dark, ruined expanse of the armory. The interior was a tomb. Broken, rusted iron braziers lined the walls, long cold. Dark, rotten wood that had once formed heavy crafting tables and weapon benches was strewn violently about the perimeter of the room. Several wooden armor mannequins had fallen and lay scattered across the floorboards. Some still bore faded, pitted iron plates of outdated armor, while others sat naked and splintered in the frost. She quickly glanced back over her shoulder toward the shattered doorway to ensure Rian was still where she had left him. He hadn't moved. He was still kneeling over the snowdrift, his hands pressed tightly against his head as if trying to hold his skull together. There were absolutely no signs that any living soul had occupied this fortress for a very long time. Stepping into the adjoining room, the garrison's mess hall, she found a row of wooden plates holding the iced, skeletal remains of small animals, alongside rusted iron tankards filled with solid, frozen black liquid. It looked like a meal interrupted centuries ago. Fortunately, buried in a heavy pile in the far eastern corner of the room lay a cache of what looked like heavy military capes, all varying in shape and bearing the faded, water-stained hues of Nostruder red. Adora began gathering the heavy cloaks into her arms, but as she pulled at the fabric, something caught her eye beneath the debris. Half buried under a collapsed iron weapon rack lay a long, beautifully curved piece of dark, polished mountain wood. She froze. Dropping the cloaks instantly, she threw herself onto her knees before the wreckage, her hands wrapping around the familiar wood as she pulled with all her might. The rack shifted with a metallic groan, and the weapon slid free. "I do not believe it," she whispered to herself, her voice cracking with a sudden, overwhelming rush of emotion. Standing upright, she brushed the thick layer of frost from the weapon she held, feeling her heartbeat skyrocket. It was her bow blade, the lethal, elegant weapon of the elven vanguard that had been violently stripped from her the day she was captured by Varric's raiders. The mere sight of the mountain wood was far more warming to her soul than any wool cloak could ever be. She ran her slender fingers along the grip. The wood was heavily scarred and weathered by the elements, but the tension in the string was perfect. It was still in flawless working condition. Securing the bow blade safely around her shoulder, she gathered the dropped cloaks back into her arms and made her way back out to Rian. When she re-entered the main armory room, she found Rian standing by one of the shattered tables closest to the entrance. He was stroking the rotting wood gently with his palm, his eyes distant. "This is the exact spot where I first met Garth," Rian said softly, speaking more to the empty room than to her. "Can you believe that?" Adora placed the heavy bundle of cloaks onto a nearby table and walked over to him, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's funny to think about now," Rian continued, a bitter, tragic smile touching his lips. "When I first saw him standing here, adjusting his armor, I actually found him a little annoying. He was always so relentlessly enthusiastic about everything, so eager to please, so proud to be a soldier. Maybe that should have been my biggest giveaway that not all was as it seemed. No real soldier in a dying world is that happy." Adora squeezed his shoulder firmly, her silence offering more comfort than words could manage. "I miss him, Adora," he said, turning his face to meet hers. "So do I, Rian," she replied softly. "So do I." Rian pulled himself away from the table, his attention shifting to the bundle Adora had deposited, and then to the magnificent weapon slung across her back. "Your bow!" he exclaimed, a rare flash of genuine light appearing in his eyes. Adora nodded, a proud smile breaking through her fatigue. She turned back to the table, sorting through the salvage. "These cloaks were all I could find in the mess hall, but they will have to do for now." She took up the largest, heaviest crimson cloak and stepped forward, wrapping it securely around Rian's broad shoulders. The thick fabric covered the entirety of his upper body, leaving a wide, voluminous hood that he could pull up over his mouth and nose for extra protection against the biting air. She then selected a second cloak, wrapping it around herself. Finally, she handed him a few smaller strips of heavy linen fabric, which Rian wrapped tightly around his bare hands before tucking the ends securely into his iron arm braces. Rian looked down at his bulkier silhouette, letting out a faint grunt. "We look completely ridiculous." "The added heat more than makes up for the loss of style, sir," Adora countered playfully, adjusting her hood. "Ready?" Rian nodded. He turned toward the exit, taking one last lingering look at the broken table where a young, enthusiastic elven boy had once stood, before casting the memory aside. They climbed back up the frosty stone stairs and began navigating their way toward what they assumed was the grand citadel at the center of the city. But the deeper they ventured into the city's frozen heart, the more the environment seemed to rebel against their presence. The air felt like a physical weight, thick and suffocating, actively pressing the breath back down their throats. Every single surface, from the cobblestones to the grand pillars, was armored in a thick sheet of black ice, slick and gleaming like polished obsidian under the oppressive gray sky. Every few minutes, they were forced to dive out of the way as massive, heavy shards of ice toppled off the edges of the high rooftops, smashing and splintering like glass upon the cobblestones. "Don't look up," Adora muttered sharply, her breath pluming in a thick, ragged cloud before her face. Rian paused, his heavy boots momentarily freezing to the icy slush of the street for a fraction of a second before he forced his weight into another step. "Why? What's up there?" "The icicles clinging to the eaves of the buildings," Adora replied, keeping her chin tucked deep into the collar of her cloak. "They're angled outward, directly against the path of the wind." Rian swallowed hard, his throat burning from the dry, sterile air. "What does that mean?" "Ice doesn't freeze against the directional push of the wind, Rian," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously to the rooftops. "Not naturally. Something is drawing the frost toward the center of this place." As they continued to navigate the twisting avenues, Rian suddenly froze in his tracks. This time, it wasn't the bitter cold that paralyzed him, but a sudden, violent realization of his surroundings. Adora, who had been scanning the high ridges, accidentally barged straight into his back, not realizing he was about to stop. "What is it?" she asked, resetting her balance. Rian didn't answer. His wide gaze was locked entirely on a heavy oak door belonging to a modest, 2-story stone building on the corner of the square. "I know this place," he said, his voice dropping to a nervous whisper. Rian slowly pushed forward through the snow, his wrapped hands reaching out to grip the freezing metal handle. He attempted to push the door inward, but it didn't budge an inch, locked tight by time and ice. He gritted his teeth, throwing his weight into a second attempt, but the wood remained rigid. "Is this where you found the old scholar, Zarek, before?" Adora asked, stepping up to the threshold, unsure why he was risking an entry. "No," Rian muttered, his jaw setting. "Someone else. Someone who helped me a few times when my mind was breaking. Someone I thought was a true friend." Stepping back a pace, he threw his entire shoulder violently against the center of the door. With a loud, splintering crack, the ancient wood broke completely free from its frosty, rusted hinges, clattering loudly onto the interior floorboards. The deafening echo of the crash reverberated through the dark, empty rooms before an oppressive silence returned to the street. "Sigrid!" Rian called out into the gloom, his hand resting on his sword hilt as he struggled to see through the darkness. He took a few cautious steps into the room. The interior looked just as abandoned, cold, and dead as the rest of the fortress. "Rian, I really don't think anyone is here," Adora said softly, stepping through the ruined frame behind him. "No one living, anyway." He wasn't listening to her warnings. He was far too invested, driven by a desperate curiosity to check out the layout of the room and its frozen belongings. Surprisingly, compared to the sterile stone of the armory, there was still a lingering bit of color to this space. The rough stone walls were still clad in hanging woven fabrics and faded dresses. In the far corner sat a small bed, its frozen blankets hinting at ancient hues of vibrant green and gold beneath a thin layer of crystalline frost. On a heavy wooden table in the center of the room lay a leather-bound book, left wide open, its pages remarkably preserved and entirely legible. All across the counters and rafters were the remnants of a vast collection of plants, roots, and dried herbs, some sealed in glass jars, others hanging limply from iron hooks. The place did not look ancient or decayed. Instead, the domestic layout suggested a life violently interrupted. "I assume she was a healer of sorts?" Adora noted, stepping up to the table. She began studying the open book, her slender fingers gently flipping through the brittle parchment pages. "Yeah, she was," Rian replied somberly, his eyes tracing the herb racks. "She was the one who helped medicine me back to sanity after I first woke up in the Citadel. And she took care of me again after you were captured by Varric. She is... well, she was a friend." The thought was a poison in his mind. Was Sigrid real? Or was she merely another layer of the grand illusion engineered to keep him compliant? Rian continued to search the perimeter of the room, but he was suddenly pulled back by the sound of Adora's breath catching. She was holding the journal tightly in both hands now, reading the script thoroughly. Her face had gone entirely pale, her expression a horrific mixture of deep intrigue and absolute distress. It was clear she had stumbled upon something deeply disturbing. "What is it?" Rian asked, stepping over to her side. "Did she write down anything of note?" Adora slowly raised her gaze to face him, her green eyes wide with horror. "You could say that," she replied hesitantly, her voice shaking. Rian looked down at the page as Adora used a trembling finger to point to the elegant, hurried cursive script. "It's a medical journal of sorts," Adora explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. "At first, the entries are just standard notes on different compounds of mountain plants, poultices, and chemical reactions. But the tone suddenly shifts a page or two later, Rian. It's as if she herself changed. Or her orders did." She looked up at him, a look of profound pity in her eyes. "This is going to be incredibly distressing to hear, Rian, but you need to know. I'll skim through the worst of it." Adora smoothed out the crumpled parchment, her fingers trembling against the ink as she began to read aloud. Entry 42. The alchemical draft has worked wonders for the necessary memory loss. The boy remembers absolutely nothing, not even his own name, nor the true origin of his wound. The severe disorientation is merely a temporary side effect. His compliance with Commander Varric's orders has doubled since the initial brain fever broke. The physical wound on his upper forehead will take weeks to heal properly, but it serves as an excellent, flawless justification for his amnesia. We shall continue to tell him he was brutally attacked by elven raiders on the road. It is far easier for a young boy to accept a lie of war than the horror of the truth. Adora swallowed hard, a sickening knot forming in her throat as her eyes darted further down the page where the ink grew frantic and hurried. The alterative surgery was a total success. Removing the pointed, distinct tips of his ears was a stroke of absolute genius on Varric's part. It grounds the human narrative entirely. To any passing eye or scout, the boy is now nothing more than an ordinary human general. The illusion of his humanity is seamless. His true elven past is effectively buried in the dirt. Adora flipped the heavy page over, the suffocating silence of the frozen room pressing in around them like a vice. She opened her mouth to continue reading the next paragraph, but before she could utter another syllable, Rian's hand shot forward. He slammed the book shut beneath her fingers, staring down at the blank leather cover. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking violently as a wave of nausea hit him. "No more. Don't read any more. I had my dark suspicions about what they did to your body when I saw the scars on your head," Adora said, her voice dripping with an intense, burning rage. "But this is just pure, unadulterated cruelty. Do you think Garth went through this too?" Rian questioned, his eyes wild as he stared at his own hands. Was he one of our kin whose body was carved up to look like a man? "I can guarantee you he did," Adora said firmly, her hand gripping the handle of her bow blade. Rian shivered violently at the realization, a sudden, sickening rush of heat flaring beneath his skin despite the ambient ice of the room. His mind began to spin into a dark abyss of horror. What other unspeakable cruelties had the architects of this city participated in? What other horrific experiments had they tried on the captive elves, or even on the real men of Nostrudor? How deep did this web of manipulation truly go? He didn't breathe. He stared blankly at his palms, his entire identity fracturing into 1,000 jagged pieces. His past wasn't his. His very body had been surgically altered, his ears clipped like an animal's, his life built entirely upon a meticulously engineered lie. "Rian." Adora's voice was a breathless, terrified fracture. A sudden massive shadow cut across the empty gray light of the open front doorway. It didn't merely pass by the entrance, it glided. It was a sudden towering eclipse of darkness that completely swallowed the pale twilight filtering through the broken frame. There was absolutely no sound of heavy boots crunching on the packed snow outside. No footsteps, no breath, no rustle of fabric. There was only the faint, sickening metallic scrape of something solid and sharp brushing lightly against the stone doorframe. The air inside the room instantly dropped 20 degrees, turning so violently, aggressively cold, that their next breaths caught like shards of broken glass in their throats. Rian's head snapped toward the shattered entrance, every protective instinct exploding to life as his hand flew to the hilt of his silver sword. Beside him, Adora choked back a sharp gasp, dropping the medical journal entirely. It hit the frozen floorboards with a dull, hollow thud. In perfect unison, they lunged toward the exit, their eyes scanning the warped, icy street through the broken doorway, swords half drawn. Nothing. The avenue outside was nothing but a barren, frozen stretch of gray stone and white snow. The swirling banks of fog drifted lazily across the cobblestones, completely undisturbed, as if the towering shape had been nothing more than a trick of the dying light. But as Rian stepped closer to the threshold, his eyes dropped to the exterior wall. On the outside of the stone doorway, a fresh, thick, rapidly expanding spiderweb of black frost was blooming violently upward from the exact spot where the shadow had just been hovering. They looked at each other, their eyes wide, their lips sealed in a terrified silence. Neither of them felt the slightest desire to make the first move, to take the first step out into the open air of the street where the thing had vanished. Once, at least a full minute had ticked by in agonizing silence, the immediate spike of adrenaline began to recede, and their shoulders relaxed slightly. "We are leaving this room, right now," Adora stated, her voice tight and unyielding. She turned and marched straight through the doorway, her bow blade held ready across her chest. Rian took one final, deep, freezing breath of the room's tainted air, pulled the heavy red cloak up further over his mouth and nose, and stepped out into the fog behind her, ready to face whatever ancient horror they had just stumbled upon.